Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. Today, we have a special guest in a special podcast where we're talking about Eurasia. And my guest is Glen Howard. How are you, Glen?
Hi, thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. We haven't talked in a while. I think last time live in DC and maybe during COVID once we met. Yeah, I guess it was something like that. So I think we haven't spoken since the war in Ukraine started. But before we dive into the discussion, I want to introduce Glenn a little bit. He's the president and chairman of the Saratoga Foundation. You can Google it. You can browse it on internet. There are many prominent figures in this organization. Glenn has been dealing with Eurasian matters, and this is, I think, proper description of it. And formerly, he was known as president of the Jamestown Foundation for 2 decades. So it was always a pleasure to talk to you. I once remembered I visited your office in DC, and you started talking to me by saying that you've always been a Mackinder guy, kind of, and that made me read a lot about Mackinder and stuff. So I even mentioned it. I mentioned you basically as a figure in one of my books, quoting you about Mackinder, something like that. I remember. But to the audience, before we started recording, we already dived into the discussion, because we were so rushed, so happy to see each other that we started talking about the naval and maritime strategies from Corbett to Mahan, Gorshkov, and Ukrainian perspective of it. So why don't we just continue with that, saying that what is the Russian perspective of the maritime strategy? You started by saying that this is the concept how the Russians view those things is completely different from how the American audience, how American strategists are thinking.
Well, I appreciate your kind words, and it's great to be with you again. I value your thinking as much as you value mine, and it's always very rich discussion. So I just regret that I'm not there to sit down and talk to you in person. You asked about what were the major developments that occurred in the past year, and what do I think about them? And I would say as we enter 2025, one of the major developments that I think the West and American policymakers and even the incoming Trump administration people don't have fully fathomed or understood the strategic significance of 10,000 North Korean soldiers being deployed to Kursk. You've heard American policymakers that were previously in the administration, Republican, and in the Trump administration. They talk about the Indo-Pacific. They talk about pivoting to the Indo-Pacific region. They talk about the importance of moving away from Ukraine and focusing more on the Asia Pacific and not so much on Europe, and how the Ukraine war is draining American resources. Those are fair points, but the deployment of 10,000 North Koreans really means that the Indo-Pacific is now beginning in Ukraine. And so whatever boundaries and concepts that we had spatially about the war in Ukraine have changed with that deployment. And why do I say that? Because Americans don't think in terms of spatial terms. They don't understand balance of power in Europe. And Henry Kissinger once said that if there's one thing that he hoped that he could teach Americans and American policymakers was the importance about the balance of power. And unfortunately, they don't understand how, say, if Ukraine falls, what does that matter? How does that affect Europe's security? How does it make suddenly Russia a Balkan power again because it's now bordering on Moldova? And how that affects Romania and the Black Sea. So Americans aren't able to attach that. So going back to what I said about the North Koreans, is that North Korea has really become an extension of Russia, but it's through the continental landmass of Eurasia that is being changed. And so the connections between, say, North Korea and Kursk, and you're looking at a map and you're thinking about how 10,000 North Koreans suddenly showed up in the space of 2 months and have started fighting. This has great implications for how Europe thinks about security and how Poland, and even say Estonia in Narva might think when one day 10,000 North Koreans show up on across the river in Narva. And so this is very important because it shows a kind of a changing of way we think about Eurasia, and how Putin and Russia, following the Byzantines, have lost their manpower, and now they're searching Eurasia for all the foot soldiers they can find, whether it's in Nepal or say it's in Buryatia. And so they're trying to find manpower to fight the war because they're looking for cannon fodder. And so how we think about Eurasia has greatly changed because of the connectivity of this region between East and West, between Europe and Asia. And it's growing. And so, but we in the way the West and American policymakers think of it, we box it off. We say, well, there's the Indo-Pacific and then there's Europe, okay? And Europeans don't pay for their security, therefore, why do we need to support them? So here we are. We have a new administration coming in that is talking about raising GDP spending on defense and in Europe, and how they want to change it from, to 3% and even to 5%. And so this is the new standard. Now, that's no problem for Poland. It's no problem for the Baltic states who are raising their GDP spending on defense. So, but we have a new administration coming in that will think differently and strategically. But it also, what I would say is that the strategic environment that the first Trump administration experienced in 2016 is vastly different now. And so at that time, there were not 10,000 North Koreans fighting inside of Russia, inside of Kursk, fighting Ukrainians. And now you have all these missiles and drones being lobbed back and forth. Yesterday, you woke up this morning in Poland to read about Ust-Luga was attacked by Ukrainian drones again. And Ust-Luga is a major port on the Baltic, and it has great strategic significance because of all the fertilizers that go through there. So one spark from one of those drones could ignite and create a major firestorm that affects neighboring St. Petersburg. And so I think that was why the Biden administration, which was very risk averse, was warning Ukraine about attacking Russian cities and Russian strategic facilities using their drones. So this is, I can go on and on about this. It's changing. One of the new realities in our part of the world is obviously Syria. Turkey has always been a very important strategic ally of Poland. Great connectivity, except for the Second Battle of Vienna, right? But
it was long ago.
It was long ago. But the point is that you have a new sheriff in town in Syria. The new Turkey has growing military and strategic power in the Mediterranean and in Syria. You have Azerbaijan in the Caspian, which is now militarily becoming a regional power in the Caspian, and in Karabakh through its military activity and successes there. So, and Russia is very much in retreat. You see the situation in the Mediterranean now, where losing access to its naval base in Tartus. It's in great flux, as we say. We hear discussion of the Russians maybe pivoting to Libya, trying to use possibly exchange Benghazi as a new naval base if they lose access to Tartus. You have Chechens running around Syria and many Caucasian nationalities in Syria that are very excited about the prospects of a new free Syria and what it may mean for their movement. You have Circassians there as well. So we're in a new stage. We're turning the pages into a new chapter on Eurasia. And I think that it's very, very important. And the Russians are in retreat. It's no doubt. The loss in Syria is a huge geopolitical setback to Putin, but they're clinging on, and the Russians are clinging on in Syria. We don't know whether they may stay. This again, the Russians are weak, but no one's banging on the door to push them in. And it's very much affected them strategically. Whether the United States and the Trump administration push on them, we don't know. They might, and you don't know if Turkey is going to push on them in Syria. This is something that I've been debating with some of my Turkish colleagues, because the importance of Russia pivoting to Libya means that General Haftar could be strengthened with 1,000 Russians and all their armored equipment that moves out of Tartus. And if they move into Libya, it affects the government, the GNA government there in Tripoli, which is backed by Turkey. So this has a geopolitical repercussions of Syria, can affect the environment in Libya. But really, there's a lot of questions and doubts whether the Russians might be able to pull this off. You saw the Ursa Major cargo ship go down. Sabotage is what they believe it was. So now the Russians don't have the heavy transport capability to move stuff in and out of the Mediterranean to actually evacuate their forces in Syria. So that's what we're seeing now, is that I've jokingly used the term Dunkirk. Is Tartus in Syria Putin's Dunkirk? You know, they're trying to evacuate forces. They don't have the naval capabilities to do it. Today, I read a story in Naval News that there are no Russian Kilo submarines now operating in the Mediterranean. So here we are, you and I sitting here, early January 2025, as two people who love to talk about geopolitics, and this is the geopolitical chessboard, to quote Dr. Brzezinski, the Eurasia chessboard is being reshaped as we talk. And we don't know. The Russians are in limbo, no doubt. And they've got problems in Ukraine. But Ukraine also has problems, right? And they also have manpower shortages and problems. And then you have a Biden administration that was highly risk averse, always instructing Ukraine, don't do this, don't do that, don't attack Russian oil refineries because we don't Russian oil production to decline and there to be a shortage of oil on the world market. Therefore, American consumers will suddenly wake up one morning and be paying more at the gas pump when they're buying gas. That was the geopolitical rationale of the Biden administration for instructing Ukraine not to attack Russian oil refineries with drones. And so Ukraine was being held back in this new strategy of using technology and drones to fight in a way that asymmetrically that it couldn't fight before. And then the United States is telling it, instructing it not to do that. So now we have a new administration coming in with the Trump people, but they do think more in terms of traditional forms of deterrence. And one of the things that I'm constantly talking to some of my colleagues here in Washington that they constantly reemphasize is that the United States has lost the art of deterrence. It's no longer what it meant during the Reagan era, where everything is risk averse. You don't want to start World War III. That's the thinking. And even parts of the Trump administration and some of his advisors think in those terms. Well, we don't want to start World War III with Russia. Okay, but at the same time, we want to instruct the Russians that there's red lines. And Trump was really big on this in Syria with the red lines in Syria when he ordered the airstrikes inside of Syria in his first administration that killed over 200 members of Wagner in one air battle. And he knew the risks involved. But from then on, the Russians learned their lessons. So the key thing is that the Russians are highly eclectic. They learn by rules. And the rules from the Biden administration was always instructing them, well, don't do that. Like a school teacher instructing a student, don't do that. That sets a bad precedent. And Trump said, well, if the Russians were threatening to invade Ukraine, I would tell them, don't do that. And if you do it, expect X, Y, and Z. So what he meant was, and constantly referred to, was the art of deterrence. What he was threatening is under his administration, if the Russians would have invaded Ukraine, it would have never happened because he meant what he said when he warned them. The problem with the Biden administration was when they warned them and said, don't do it, there was no big stick to back it up. It was like, hitting a schoolboy on the wrist and saying, bad boy, we're going to threaten you with sanctions and we'll destroy your economy. Well, I mean, here we are, my dear friend, 3 years after the invasion, now entering the fourth year of the Ukraine war, and we thought sanctions would end it all. It would force the Russians to get out of Ukraine. Well, here we are. They're still there. And not only that, there's 10,000 North Koreans helping Putin. So I think a lot of our conceptions and were wrong. And I think a lot of the way the approaches by the Biden administration are wrong. So how the Trump people approach this, who think more in Reagan terms of deterrence, peace through strength. In other words, back up what you mean, you say when you say don't do it, back it up with force. That's one of the thing unknowns that we will know about the Trump administration, but I think that they will back it up with military force when they make threats. That's one of the things when they talk about making peace in Ukraine, I think that's what they mean, is that we will give peace a chance, but if the Russians don't play along and they start insulting 𝗙𝗂𝗏 and making fun of him and making very snide comments, such as 𝗦𝗏 made in his Financial Times interview, where he chastised 𝗙𝗂𝗏, that was the wrong approach. But if they play that game and do that, it won't sit well with the Trump people. So the question is, what will the Trump people do? And Trump has made statements saying that if the Russians don't play along, we will open up everything for Kiev. And he's on record as saying that during the campaign earlier this year.
And let's take it from here and let's try to speculate what might happen. And I will give you a sober opinion in Warsaw, what we think about this prospect. And let's, confront me on that, please, okay? Maybe your thinking is different. So first of all, the Russians are thinking that they are winning the war, okay? They're winning the war. And still, they will not accept the peace terms anything less than they demanded in December 2021, which includes the security architecture twisted to their favor, including Poland, Baltic states, and so on. And which means that short of really kind of a shocking situation where Trump would accept it, Trump will have to think how to compel the Russians to behave. So he will have to escalate the conflict. And now question one, how the Americans can escalate the conflict if there is problem with ammo production in the US, with inventories of precise munition in the US, especially the Taiwan crisis is looming, and when there is no manpower in the Ukrainian forces. They are, on the last legs. So there is a real threat that this escalation, by providing more and having more of Ukrainians, will not work. So then there will be a horizontal escalation. Like, sanctions are leaky. So why don't we block the Baltic Sea, quarantine the Russian cargo? And then we have a horizontal escalation, a hybrid warfare. And then the question is whether the Americans are ready to impose quarantine or the Americans will use the allies to do it, and whether the Americans are ready to help consolidate in hybrid warfare any breaches that the Russians may make against Poland, Baltic states, and so on. And so far, we haven't seen this enthusiasm on the American side to be part of it. Actually, I must confess, Glenn, that the war in Ukraine proved to Poles that Americans know the balance of power very well, as Nicholas Spykman rightly stated in the 40s of the 20th century. Even Wilson understood it with this Wilson program of independence in Eastern Europe, and that the Americans actually and the deterrence failed. The war was not deterred, and also it's the Russians that isolated Ukraine properly by nuclear brinkmanship from lack of escalation control on the Russian side and horizontal escalation that would include NATO in any element. So how would you react to what I just said?
First of all, I don't think Trump would even know what horizontal escalation means. And he's not of the school of terminology. But the instincts are of that. I mean, you want to put we could put a label on it, say, well, that's what he's doing is horizontal escalation. Of course it is. But would he in his mind think that? No. His mind is you cross a line, you're going to get whacked. And so, yeah, that's horizontal escalation. So, I mean, and that's what he refers to. He loves surprise. And I'll go back to the case in point. I'm currently reading McMaster's memoirs, which are fascinating. I highly encourage anybody people in your audience out there to get a copy of it. It's available in Polish. I would read it because it's great insight into the personality of Trump. And one of the things he said in the book that I agree with about Trump is that he's a contrarian. So a lot of times he will start off in one position only because he's a contrarian. So he tries to go against whatever the conventional thinking is. Does he really think that? Probably not. We don't know. But people instinctively, when he says something, oh, they conclude that that's what he really meant. And he likes to play with people in terms and concepts because he wants people to try to identify him and pinpoint him. So going back to horizontal escalation, I think that, and Ukraine, I think the key issue with many of the Republicans and how they view Ukraine, the Ukraine war. And I was just watching the Ken Waltz or Mike Waltz interview, who is Trump's incoming national security advisor. And many of these people are kind of the advisors around Trump. You could label them, call them neoconservative. But the person who calls the shots is really Trump. And so these people, and he's had advisors around him like John Bolton, McMaster, and others that were very conservative, basically of our school of thinking about how to deal with the Russians. Trump has traditionally had people around him like that. But I think that this incoming group of advisors will listen to Trump because he's very adamant that he wants things to go in a certain direction. So when you go back to talk about how they view Ukraine, their concern is that there was no effort by the Biden administration to develop an end game for Ukraine. That their approach was very in the spirit of Lyndon Johnson, and meaning the 1960s, we will keep pouring resources into Vietnam. We will keep helping. We will do it as long as it takes, right?
Also within the escalation management. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And the whole theory of escalation management is also very, I forget the term now. Nadia Shadlow actually coined the term, or it was reminded me about that term. But the point is that there was a unlimited flow of resources in Ukraine, whereas the Trump people, thinking economically, think about it in terms of the drain of resources on the United States.
Yeah.
So so there are many aspects about Trump that are very Nixonian. And so one part is Nixonian idea of the madman theory, that he's constantly talking about wild issues because he wants to put his opponent, put them off balance so that they can't pinpoint him and say, oh, what is he thinking? And so the madman theory also is very relevant here from the 1970s in terms of how you look at Trump. Now, going back further into how he reacts to certain things, the point is that they don't view Ukraine as a source of unlimited funding. But the other good side to it is that they want to wrap things up. Now, you look at what Trump has said about what Israel's doing in Gaza and the standoff there on the hostages that have been held. Trump's view in message to Netanyahu has been wrap it up by January 20th. I want this thing to end. So that can also be said and extended to Ukraine. There's a part where he doesn't want to go on 4 years, and he doesn't want to be at the end of his administration where Ukraine is still trying to wrap it up or trying to deal with the Russia. So I think that in his mind, he was asked a question, I think, about would you give F-16s to Ukraine? Well, he said it depends. And so the idea on F-16s is that it would be part of a package of not worrying about escalation with Russia, but more of a way, I will give them the weapons they need to wrap it up, to get this thing over with. Germany has had all this hand-wrenching about whether to give the TARDIS missiles. Schultz has debated about the Ukrainians said, we want the TARDIS to blow up the Kerch Straits Bridge. And they've said, oh, no, it's escalation, World War III. We don't want to do that. I can see the Trump people giving Ukraine certain weapons it needs to win militarily. And whatever that means, that will be up to the Ukrainians to decide. But the point is they don't want what happens in Ukraine to go on endlessly. Now, they're going to give peace a chance. And if Putin doesn't play along with them, I think they'll stand back and say, look, we tried. now we'll give Ukraine what they want. Now, I've counted 3 advisors to Trump, okay, 3 of them, Hegseth, Keith Kellogg, and Mike Waltz, all of which have used the term genocide in Ukraine. I point this out to my Ukrainian colleagues, and they've like, really? Did I say it? And I said, well, you should watch their interviews, sit down and see what they said in their interviews. But people are too busy reading the headlines of CNN or the New York Times to really pay attention to spend 30 minutes to watch their interviews. And all 3 of these people have used these types of terms to describe the war in Ukraine. Now, this to me does not sound like appeasement. And they certainly don't approach it from that mindset. But then again, I've been told by people that some of these advisors around Trump are what they call, quote unquote, recovering neocons. So, meaning people like Marco Rubio, who once were neoconservative and very hard line on Russia and in China. But the question is that people have asked, and I've asked the question, I said, what will they be like when they're around Trump? Well, it was a very interesting decision by Trump to name Rubio Secretary of State. I think it was a very smart move because people looked at the decision because, Rubio is the one who passed the legislation about the U.S. remaining as a part of member of NATO, and that if Trump ever pulled out of NATO, he would have to legislatively do it. Now, this is the person that Trump's appointed Secretary of State. Now, so that doesn't sound like to me that the Trump people are ready to sell out the U.S. and NATO. So again, there are certain aspects of the people and appointments. And Rubio, I think personally, was more about Laura Trump and having his daughter-in-law move into being to fill the Rubio Senate seat. See, when they looked at Rubio being appointed Secretary of State, they weren't thinking about how this might be domestically, politically inside the United States, because the person that will decide on who fills the Senate seat for Rubio will be the governor of Florida, who is Ron DeSantis, and who doesn't have the warmest relations with Trump. So there are important internal issues related to how the United States moved forward and naming people. But when they get into this position, going back to your question about Ukraine, horizontal escalation, I think the tendency is to send a message to the Russians that not to cross these lines. And I think all these advisors around Trump unquestionably would favor those types of responses. If the Russians cross the line on anything, they will not be shy about using military power to back it up. I will quote to you the same thing that Matt Pottinger, one of his former advisors in Asia in the first administration, told me one time in an interview. He was talking about the story when President Trump had President Xi at Mar-a-Lago, and Trump at that time was being advised, and that whole episode is recounted in McMaster's book, and if anyone wants to read about it. So it's pretty accurate what Matt Pottinger had told me. But basically, Trump was sitting at a table, and he knew about the U.S. planning to launch airstrikes in Syria and using the Tomahawk. So when he was at the table, he asked Xi to get up and leave the table. He says, "Excuse me, I got to leave for a second. I'll come right back." So he comes right back to the table, and he did this for dramatic effect. So he knew about the strikes, and he was pulled aside about it. And Trump himself has retold this episode several times. And so as he's sitting over dinner with Xi, he comes back to the table, and as Xi, in the middle of chewing something, he said, "Sorry, I had to be excused for a few seconds. I just came back, and oh, by the way, I've just ordered an airstrike with 60 Tomahawks on Syria because we told them to stop barrel bombing, and Assad wouldn't listen to us." And so, and he actually enjoyed saying that, and he basically said that Xi choked on his food as Trump was telling this to him. So why is that important? Because Trump likes the dramatic effect of using military force and its impact on and say in this case on Xi, because he knew that would have an impact. So this is one of those little glimpses into the persona of Trump that I really like. Because it does kind of shed some insight into how he thinks about things, and he does think in terms of television in a Reagan way but it's in a different style of Reagan. It's in Trump's style of maybe The Apprentice, as a TV show. Yeah. So I'll stop there. But that, to answer your question, I think a lot of things about horizontal escalation, the Baltics. His advisors are very much pro-NATO, but there's a limit to U.S. investment, and they want the Europeans. And it's more, and as I was told by some of the Trump people, is that when Trump talks about GDP spending in Europe, it's more not directed against Poland, it's more directed at France and Germany. And those countries, and Belgium, which barely even pays 1% of defense spending. It's more about those countries than it is about you guys. And I would say one other point for your listeners. I don't think there's ever been a U.S. president that has been more attuned to Eastern Europe than Trump. You know, keep in mind his wife is Slovenian. He's from East, so and his one of his former wives was from the Czech Republic. So there's no, and he had a very close relationship with President Duda. And the thing about Trump is that he tends to listen, in my opinion, he tends to listen to East Europeans more than he listens to Western Europeans. Now, excluding Macron, I think that he listens to East Europeans. And the episode is that last December, when Congress was holding back defense spending or the defense assistance for Ukraine, and Speaker Johnson came in, and Johnson was not embracing the delivery of aid for Ukraine because Trump was holding it up. And when Trump made his decision to approve of the assistance, and he notified Johnson about it, ending the Republican standoff on assistance to Ukraine, the person that made Trump change his mind about giving assistance to Ukraine was President Duda when he came. He was our former president when he came to New York. Still the president when he came to Bedminster, New Jersey, to meet with Trump. And the media reporting at that time said it was Duda who convinced Trump that he needed to do this. So the point here is that the person that convinced Trump to change his mind was someone from East Central Europe. And I think we need to keep that important point in mind, that Trump does think about East Central Europe more than other U.S. presidents. He's more closer to the region because of his family and his ties and his business connections there, but also pointed to the Three Cs initiative. And we had discussion beforehand, is that Trump is the one that put $300 million to support the Three Cs initiative and make it happen. Now, obviously, Three Cs initiative has fallen off the radar, not been pursued. But the point is, strategically, he supported an initiative called the Three Cs initiative and put U.S. financial resources behind it. So this is a person that thinks strategically, but we often don't think about it because we're too busy chastising him for whatever he posts on Twitter or saying things. So, and I think you need to take a step back and look at grand strategy, and I think he does a pretty good job about it. And some of the things I've been pointing out, and I'll stop here, is that the Trump administration people, when they think about how to counter the European Union, they need to start thinking about new trade bodies and strategic bodies like the Organization of Turkic States. That this is a new trade and economic body emerging in Central Asia with Turkey as a part of it that could become a new trade bloc to counter the European Union. And this could be something where the United States plays and the Trump administration plays a major role in trying to help, maybe even join the organization and help it develop, because it will become a trade bloc between the Russian-dominated CSTO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization backed by China, and it could be an organization in between and could become NATO-like. And I actually asked this question of President Aliyev when I saw him last year in December in Baku. I was at an event and asked him the question about what was going to have the future of the Organization of Turkic States. And I said, could it become like NATO? And he said, it could possibly become like NATO. Why not? And people aren't tracking that issue here in Washington. A few people are in Washington are watching this. So there are new ideas, new concepts coming up. Trump thinks in terms of trade blocs. He thinks about U.S. leverage against the European Union. And as you wrote about and talked about the tariffs and Bretton Woods, a lot of things are going to change with this administration. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, you mentioned also the Middle East. Towards the end of our conversation, I'd like to have a word on the Middle East and on Trump's persona, kind of. Let's draw on your description. for many years in the past, the consecutive U.S. administrations have been having problems with Israel and Israel foreign policy in the Middle East in terms of calibrating it in the balance of power, what to do with Turkey, with Iran, Saudi Arabia, all those. Some even claim that it was all about trying to contain and withhold Israel's hand sometimes from attacking Iran and stuff. Trying to find the middle ground between the different factions in the Middle East. And it seems, at least on surface, that Trump's appointment in the Middle East so far, and his attitude may go in a different direction. There are some who claim that the Trump will allow Israel to do what Israel wants in terms of Iran. The containing of Iran will be harsher, measures tougher, and the United States don't give a proper care what is going on in the Middle East in terms of the petrodollar and the petrol, the oil, because Trump's gonna drill more oil and gas in U.S. proper. So it will be even to the favor of the United States that there will be a kind of a, imbalance of power. Let me put it that way, chaos in the Middle East, because the world will be buying from the United States, including the Europeans, as opposed to from the Middle East. So a kind of it seems like a grand strategy might be changing, the U.S. grand strategy towards the Middle East. What do you in this way, in this cunning way, Trump might this time around exploit Israel, so that Israel serves American interest by allowing it, by paradox, by allowing Israel to do what it wants in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and against Iran and southern Lebanon and in Syria. In this way, it will get tangled in a major showdown in the Middle East, and it will be the Israelis, not the United States, that will have to clean the house. So it will be a reversal of the roles in the Middle East so far. What do you think about this?
I think the Trump administration comes in where Israel has very much had military successes in all its various fronts. The big unknown known is what's going to happen in Yemen, and I don't see American boots on the ground in Yemen trying to stop the Houthis, and I don't see Israeli boots on the ground in Yemen trying to stop the Houthis. So we have a conundrum there in the Red Sea. But turning to Israel, Israel's has had major military successes, and Iran is in retreat. You have, the Shiite crescent is no longer. I mean, it's been devastated. So President Trump has mentioned that he wants the situation in Gaza with Israel to be wrapped up, and he doesn't want this scene to keep going on. And so we need to start with that point because he's appointed these Middle East envoys to go there. And so I think that when I read something yesterday, Trump had said that his overwhelming strategic priority with Israel, and as he comes into power into January, is that he wants a full normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But in order to get that, things have got to be wrapped up on the Israeli side in Gaza. So this will be the thing to look for and watch for. I think that the United States, it's obviously Trump has appointed very pro-Israel people that into these positions as envoys. But we should not lose sight of the fact that Trump regards his biggest strategic success in the Middle East is the Abraham Accords, and he wants this to continue. And he wants it to continue with the normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia is not fully on board with that yet because of the situation in Gaza. So this is where we stand. And going to your point about obviously maximum pressure 2.0 is going to be Iran is really, really weakened. And so will they play a spoiler role in the region? I don't know. But Syria has greatly changed that because the roles have been reversed. Shiite crescent is no more. And Syria is now all about a major Sunni power that could be, and we hope will not be, a hotbed of jihadism, because you certainly have HTS, Hizb Tahrir al-Sham, coming into power with Mr. al-Jawlani, who is now known as al-Shara, coming in as the head of this interim government. So Syria doesn't seem to be the role that it would be playing, and the roles have been reversed. So you talked about the idea and importance of drill, 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 and how Trump attaches strategic importance to the importance of energy and oil. Yes, and if that happens, people have not even thought about what does that do to Russia and Saudi Arabia. If Trump is successful and he starts drilling and opening up oil reserves, and that changes the oil price and causes deployment, you could see the same situation that caused the breakup of the Soviet Union in the 1990s was what? It was the deterioration of the price of oil. That hurt the Soviet regime more than anything. It could severely impact Putin and his ability to continue the war. And I've seen videos in Moscow just the last couple of days of people. The price of butter has doubled in price in Moscow stores in the last week. And people are very upset about this. So inflation's hitting Russia. Will he be able to continue? Will Putin continue the war? What will be the strategic impact of drill, drill, drill? Because Trump will then allow LNG exports to resume to Europe, which the Biden administration, because of Senator Kerry's advice to Biden, was to stop LNG exports. So here we are. This is the environment that we face. And I think that going back to Israel, Saudi Arabia is what will happen. Will the U.S. have more leverage over Saudi Arabia because of the price of oil dropping? Will Saudi Arabia need the United States more than the U.S. needs Saudi Arabia? We don't know. But these are the unknowns in what Rumsfeld would call the known unknowns. And so as we enter 2025, we don't know the direction this will take. Now, one of the big strategic developments, I think, of 2025, and maybe we should start our own TV show on strategic predictions each year. But I would say the 𝗃-S being captured by Finland and the use, as you referred to, of hybrid warfare, was Finland drew the line in the sand and said, look, they seized a Russian rented oil tanker with intelligence equipment on, and they seized it. So for the first time, we have a member of NATO taking military action against Russian hybrid warfare. And I hope it sets a new precedent, because it's certainly leading by example. And the newest member of NATO is the one doing this and teaching the rest of it.
And that's why we need to wrap up. But that's why I'm I kind of inclined to think that there might be a Baltic blockade or Russian Baltic cargo quarantine in the coming months to be monitored. Thank you, Glenn. My guest today was Glen Howard from the Saratoga Foundation. I hope that we will have a chance to talk shortly again. I realized during our conversation that there are so many topics. We haven't touched the Pacific. We haven't touched Europe per se. I mean, what's the Western Europeans what are they going to do? So we still have a lot of stuff to talk about. Thank you very much. Looking forward.
Thanks for having me. It's great seeing you again.
Yeah, and you stay with us at Strategy and Future. Thanks a lot.